Good morning. Hello, and thank you for joining the Caneberry Educational Conference as part of the 2021 virtual Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. My name is MichaelMengak. I'm going to be the moderator and the first speaker for this event. I am a professor of wildlife ecology and wildlife extension specialist at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. We appreciate your attendance and taking the time to be with us today. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Wish Farms, for providing support for the 2021 Caneberry Educational Conference. We have a few housekeeping things that we need to go through. So let me jump right into those. For those of you that need pesticide CEU and CCA credits, I remind you the credits are available for most of the presentations during the live Southeastern Conference. You can check the pesticide guide for the list of approved presentations and participating states that are awarding credit. The pesticide guide is located at the Event Resources tab under the Media Player, and also at the Resources Center located on the main menu of the conference platform. A couple of things to keep in mind for pesticide credits: they are available only for registered attendees and only during the live conference. Credits will not be available for on-demand viewing. There are 3 simple steps to initiate receiving credits. First, go to the audience chat box located on the left side of your screen. Type your first name, last name, and the state or states for which you are requesting credits. Again, go to the audience chat box. You'll need to do this for every presentation for which you're asking or requesting credits. The second step is to sign out at the end of the presentation. To sign out, do the same thing. Go to the audience chat box, type your first name, last name, and states for which you are requesting credit. And the third step to complete the pesticide registration process is complete the pesticide registration process at the Event Resources tab. It's only necessary to do that once at the end of the conference, not for every presentation. This presentation is not pre-recorded. We have a live presentation, and you can type your questions into the audience question box, and we have myself and Dr. David Lockwood from the University of Tennessee will be available to answer questions. Again, thank you for joining us at the conference. Don't forget to visit with our sponsors and exhibitors at the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. Your support of those sponsors is much appreciated, and it helps defray the cost of this conference. There are several daily networking events for all that have registered. Morning coffee chats beginning at 8:15 and evening receptions and networking events beginning at 5 p.m. So again, I'd like to begin the presentation and start by once again introducing myself. My name is MichaelMengak. I'm joined by Dr. Dave Lockwood at the University of Tennessee. We are extension specialists at our respective schools, and I'm going to forgo the reading of bios. They were available on the website. Suffice it to say that we're extension specialists in small berries and fruit. Dr. Lockwood is with the Plant Science Department. I'm at the School of Forestry and Natural Resources as a wildlife extension specialist. Dr. Lockwood put together most of this presentation and graciously shared it with me. I made a few modifications to suit my style, but the work is largely his, and we are delivering this presentation jointly. So just to start out with some background, why control wildlife damage. I do a fair bit of work in my extension program with wildlife damage management, and we encounter these questions fairly regularly. There are a number of reasons why we work with control aspects of wildlife damage management, whether we're dealing with birds and small fruit or larger animals such as deer or wild pigs. There are significant economic losses from wildlife to a great variety of crops. The damage can be direct, fruit consumed and destroyed. It could be indirect, increased disease and insect damage. In addition to consuming the crop directly, damage can occur prior to crop development, damage to the shoots, the stems, the plants that produce the crop, girdling, rubbing, gnawing on root systems, just walking through the area could puncture plastics and damage irrigation systems. And then and occasionally a more drastic type of damage with contamination, wildlife defecation, and food safety issues. There are numerous estimates of wildlife damage for crops and sometimes specific to individual animals. The numbers are hard to pin down. We like to present them. Our bosses like to know how much damage there is, and growers, producers certainly are aware of the damage. You deal with it every day. Bird damage, different studies have tried to look at bird damage by surveying producers. One study looked at 4 crops in 5 states across the Great Lakes region and some fruit producers in California. And that one study came up with estimates of $189 million in damage. We have done other studies with deer damage to crops and come up with, again, multi-millions of dollars. Wild pigs damage crops in the 36 or 37 states where they occur. And nationwide estimates for wild pigs just in general run near $2 to $2.5 billion, sometimes broke out by individual crops, which can be rather significant. Damages take a variety of shapes, from direct consumption of fruit to injury to fruit, which makes it not saleable later on, knocking fruit off the bushes or the canes, and damage to plants. A partial list of pests would include birds. They are a major source of damage for small fruits. There's a long list of birds: starlings, robins, blackbirds, crows. Sometimes crows are overrated in their damage. Other people have significant damage from crows. Blue jays, mockingbirds, waxwings. Damage can be scattered throughout the year, or it can be concentrated at certain times of the year when migratory flocks move through an area. Certainly mammals can be damaging. Deer, one of the major sources of damage. Small mammals, mice and voles in apple orchards and blueberries, other crops. Coyotes will eat fruit. Raccoons, possums will eat fruit. Turkeys, ground squirrels, tree squirrels, a number of organisms. There are a variety of control methods also. Some are listed there, from noise devices or pyrotechnics, flagging, simply hanging ribbons or flags, and the motion of those items deters birds from eating fruit. Chemical repellents, audio frightening devices, propane cannons, Fencing is another control method. We put that one at the bottom. It may be most effective and maybe the most expensive, as we'll see as we go through some of this presentation. When I teach the wildlife damage classes or presentations for growers and homeowners and landowners and farmers and producers, we talk about categories and a model to address wildlife damage. We call it the HERL model, H-E-R-L, H-E-R-L. Some of the steps in that model are listed here. We start with simple things like habitat modification, how to change the environment to discourage the occurrence of animals, removing trees, roosting sites, things like that. We talk about harassment, everything from scarecrows to scare devices as a harassment technique. We talk about exclusion with fencing and netting that we'll go through in a little more detail. Taste and smell and odor repellents that are applied on or near the crop. And finally, removal or lethal control methods, trapping, shooting, toxicants. These are the models, or these are the steps we go through in our control model. And we work through the steps in this model, oftentimes in a systematic way, at least in our heads. We ask first, can we do anything to modify the habitat before we engage in building expensive fences? If the answer to that question is no, then we move to the next step and maybe undertake a fencing project. We do these things because, as we said, losses can be rather significant. Just some estimates of loss in blueberries to sort of drill down from those broad estimates that I gave on some of the earlier slides. But different blueberries suffer different levels of crop loss, from some fairly significant numbers there, over $7,000 to nearly $9,000 per acre. When you're suffering those kinds of losses, they are an annual loss, of course. On paper, you can justify building an expensive fence. The issue, of course, is that an expensive fence is a huge outlay up front. If it's done right, it may last 15 or 20 years. It can be justified in terms of these losses, but it's not simple. It's not a simple economic decision to invest perhaps tens of thousands of dollars in a fence, knowing that it'll save you money in the long run, but it's going to be very expensive up front. So these are the kinds of difficult decisions, economic decisions, that producers have to make. We certainly can justify it on the value of the crop over the long term, and so sometimes we can move in that direction, and sometimes we can't incur that large economic outlay up front, and we have to apply less expensive and perhaps more temporary methods. Another estimate, again, grapes, a little bit lower than the blueberries, but still pretty substantial, $2,000 to $5,000 per acre. So these are the kinds of losses we're typically dealing with. When we talk about habitat modification as one of the steps to mitigate loss or damage, it's important to remember a few things about bird habitat that contributes to the problem. Isolated plantings, more vulnerable than big plantings. Plantings near other orchards, other vineyards, tend to spread out the loss. It's an odd way of thinking about things, but if you spread the damage around, then no one producer or one field or one crop or one plant has the majority of the loss. It's spread evenly or more evenly. We also know that losses in general are never spread evenly. Sometimes one producer suffers the majority of the loss, and a producer down the street suffers nothing. We can't explain that generally. And next year it may be reversed. The recipient of the loss could be the one who didn't have any the previous year. We don't know why that happens, why birds or deer or anything else pick one crop or one field or one farm over another. So we have to be vigilant and work with this on a long-term scale. Again, smaller blocks of plants are more vulnerable than larger blocks, concentrates the birds or the offending animal in a small area, and it's easier for them to do larger amounts of damage in smaller areas rather than spreading it out across larger areas. Habitat that's near areas where birds can hide or roost or rest before they come to eat. So power lines, tree snags, other places that provide perches may increase damage. So if we can remove some of those habitat features, of course we can't generally do much about power lines, but we may avoid planting under or near power lines when we establish our crop. And of course, crops near woodlands and fields, places where birds nest, where they roost, where they hang out, are going to feel more pressure than places that are farther away from suitable bird habitat. So things to keep in mind when you're locating a place to put a crop or to establish a planting. Other types of harassment, visual scare devices. Here's a picture of a cutout, a silhouette of a predatory bird on a string. It's like a kite. It flows in the wind. The movement disturbs birds for a while. Any of these devices, streamers, spinners, I've seen aluminum pie pans. I've seen a plastic owl whose head moves. I've seen DVDs hung on strings around the edge of gardens and orchards. Anything that moves will deter birds for a little while. But birds are not dumb. Wildlife is not dumb. They get used to it fairly quickly. So some things to keep in mind when using this as a technique. Don't ever have a stationary device. They get used to that very, very quickly. Moving things around, changing the scare device or the scare tactic is better. Of course, that requires time and energy on the producer's part, but it should pay some dividends in the long run. Combining different devices is better than just having one by itself. And occasionally, some lethal control shooting or pyrotechnics, just scaring with a little bit more force than just a silent streamer or spinner might also be necessary. So a little behavioral reinforcement there might also be added. Those were silent spinners, pie pans, scarecrow. Those were silent scare devices, auditory scare devices, fireworks, pyrotechnics, bottle rockets, propane cannons, playing distress calls. These things are also used and can be effective. They have to be applied when the birds are coming to the area to feed. So maybe in the evening, as the birds are coming to feed, firing rockets, pyrotechnics, devices out of a starter pistol, something that looks like a starter pistol, firing it up in the air to keep the birds flying and moving, scare them away. Pyrotechnic cannons can be put on timers that go off at regular intervals. They're used at aquaculture facilities, at vineyards. They're used at airports. Sometimes they could also be used on small crews. Again, the effectiveness depends on the amount of damage and the animals that are causing the damage. Game birds, as you might imagine, the turkeys that are, or deer even, we're talking about birds, but even deer that are regularly shot at and hear a lot of noises, they're less susceptible to loud noises. But smaller birds that come in flocks are a little bit more susceptible to some of these loud noises. So matching the device to the damage agent, to the group of birds that's causing the damage, is important. Methyl Anthranolite is a derivative of Concord grapes. It's sold as a taste repellent. It can be kind of expensive. Last time I looked, it was a little over $100 for a gallon. Then diluted and sprayed. Sometimes it's put on golf courses to deter geese, but it can also be sprayed on crops, fruit, to deter the animals, the birds. It irritates their sense of taste. It may also leave a unpleasant aftertaste or residual chemical taste on the fruit, so some growers won't use it. It has some drawbacks. It's water soluble. It washes off in the rain or in irrigation, so it has to be applied regularly. And again, it can be expensive, but it may be a short-term alternative in some situations. With those specifics in mind, we could look at some basic generalities about bird control. And whenever dealing with wildlife damage, there are just some basic rules of thumb. It's always better to start a deterrent program before the animal, whether it be bird or mammal, learns to come and start feeding. It's easier to deter them before they start than it is to change their mind after they've already learned to go to a particular place to get the groceries. Scare devices should be operated when the birds are active. Dawn and dusk are usually the primary periods. Again, as we said before, vary the location, vary the frequency, vary the device, combining methods, and supplementing with shooting if legal and available. Moving to exclusion, there are different types of exclusion that could be used for birds. They fall into the category of netting or fencing. And while expensive, they might very well be the most effective control practice. Again, like auditory devices, install before damage begins. And depending on the type of crop and the format of harvesting, you may put them over the crop right before harvest. I've seen that done in vineyards. I've also seen them suspended up in the air, and then harvesting can occur underneath this netted dome, if you will. Again, it's like other fencing, like metal fencing or perimeter fencing. It's an expensive upfront investment, but if done properly and applied, removed after the season is over and stored properly, it can be used for several years, so the cost can be spread out over time. Here are some examples of how this might work. Again, these are some simple PVC pipes with a netting on the sides and top, protecting this crop. A little more elaborate here. This is probably rolled out with some machinery, and it's going to be very, very labor intensive and more expensive, but provide protection over a larger area. You can incorporate the netting over individual rows, as in the upper left picture here, or even enclosing an entire vineyard or fruit crop, almost like growing in a greenhouse situation, but outdoors, with the net being the walls of the greenhouse, if you will. Here's another example of total exposure. This is a Nectarine system in Australia, and you can see how expensive this would have been to install, and it's up high in the air, but yet it would allow workers to get underneath there for harvesting and cultural treatments. So a variety of different ways to install netting, from simple and temporary to quite elaborate, as you can see here. If we leave birds behind and move on to deer, deer populations are increasing. Participation in deer hunting is declining, and deer are a significant source of problems for a lot of growers. The types of damage inflicted by deer are not necessarily different from that inflicted by birds, again, feeding on shoots and crop, but they also rub their antlers on the branches and they do damage at different times of year. They're certainly a bigger animal, so walking on the crop, destroying the plastic, which removes weed control, damages irrigation, and again, safety concerns like E. coli and contamination. We can use some of the same techniques for deer control, habitat modification, stay away from cover where the deer like to hide or remove the cover. Hunting, of course, can be a little bit easier with deer than it is with birds. Birds are federally protected. Deer are under control of state agencies. So hunting on the farm, encouraging hunters to harvest does, working with landowners nearby, neighbors, to control deer can all help with damage management. Possibly even, depending on what kind of state laws you might have, getting depredation permits from the biologist or the state conservation officer, the local conservation officer, would allow you to shoot deer outside of the season. This has its own set of problems. Shooting at night when deer are active, it's a burden on the already stressed time of the growers and producers. But these are things that could be done, but they come with their own set of problems and challenges, not the least of which is what to do with all those deer that you're shooting. And there's also the possibility of conflict with the neighbors who are trying to manage to increase deer while you're trying to manage to decrease deer. So there's a lot of human-wildlife conflict or human-human conflict involved in these issues also. Repellents that work for deer, a little bit more options and more research here. Blood and tankage materials from animal waste processing plants, other types of products. Some ideas, some suggestions about applying deer repellents. They're oftentimes labeled for not to be used on edible crops. So they're area repellents. They're placed on the ground. Always read and follow label directions. Here's just another list of some examples. Malorganite is actually a 620 fertilizer. It's a granular product. It stands for Milwaukee Organic Nitrogen. It's actually processed sewage sludge. It's been around for about 85 years. It's spread in a band around crops. It has a slight odor that deer find offensive. Other things, putrefied eggs, rotten eggs. A lot of commercial repellents are made with rotten eggs. I have an X through mothballs here. It's illegal to use mothballs outside. They're a pesticide. You have to comply with the label. They're only labeled for mothballs indoors. It's illegal to use them off label and outside, so don't do that. Again, sometimes the repellents are applied to the area. Sometimes they are applied directly to the crop where the animal has to actually taste them. So again, just like the methyl anthranolite that we talked about with birds, the deer may need to come in contact. But it also may impart offensive odors or other issues, so you may not be able to apply them to the product, to the crop. Application, again, most of these things are water soluble. Most of these things break down in sunlight, so reapplication is necessary, maybe every 7 to 10 days, every time it rains heavy. As damage gets bad, you may need to increase the application. Like the scare devices, use more than one repellent, sometimes 2 and 3 in combination, mix them up, rotate them, change them. And the same guidance applies as before. Put the repellents out before the deer learn to come to your farm to do damage. Again, it's easier to stop them before they start than it is to stop them after they've already learned to come and feed there. may be temporary, work best when other food sources are abundant. If the animal's not particularly hungry and the densities aren't particularly high, it's easier to deter them and get them to go somewhere else. If they're very hungry or there's nothing else available, it's going to be harder to get them to change their behaviors. And again, I've listed a few there, and you'll notice I've crossed off human hair. There's this has been around for a long time, but there's actually no research that suggests this works. It generally fails in most research studies anyway, so I've just crossed that one out. Fencing, like netting, again, expensive, but maybe the best long-term permanent solution. It doesn't have to completely enclose the top of the area like a net would for birds, but it has to be tight to the ground. Deer would rather go under than over, so it has to be tight to the ground and secure. The discussion comes up about how big it should be, and while everybody seems to think that deer can jump 8-foot fences, I've always cautioned people that yes, they can if properly motivated, but generally 5 or 6 feet is sufficient to deter them. You don't need to have an 8-foot fence with triple strands of barbed wire on top of it. Sometimes a 5 or 6 foot fence is enough. It doesn't have to be quite as elaborate as people seem to think. The type of fencing, again, depends on the amount of pressure and how much you're willing to spend up front. It's a pretty significant outlay of capital. They can be with or without electricity. That's, again, an individual decision. How close you are to an electrical source, what kind of damage or danger or liability will you incur with an electric fence. The important thing about fences, with or without electricity, they have to be maintained. Vegetation has to be cut or sprayed near the bottom, especially if there's an electrical wire involved, so it doesn't short out or ground out. There's always the risk of trees falling on the fence and tearing it up. So a lot of maintenance involved here. Again, fences can be somewhat simple on small areas, from just a few dollars a feet, and we'll look at a couple examples of that, to some very, very expensive fence, everything from woven wire 5 feet high with additional strands on the top, 6 feet high with additional strands, to chain link fence and just about everything in between. This is a relatively simple fence. It's still expensive enough. It looks like there's 2 layers of fence here, and this is a good time to talk about the design of a fence. Fences can be single wall, or lower fences that are part of a fence system. So a fence inside of a fence can be effective, and it may be less expensive. Deer have relatively poor depth perception. So the concept behind a fence inside of a fence is that they don't have to be as tall, but a fence 3 feet inside of another fence messes up a deer's ability to perceive the distance, and that might be sufficient to keep the deer out. And it may be a 4 or 5 foot fence instead of an 8-foot fence. So again, you can play with the designs and the shape and the cost benefit analysis of these things. Slant wire fences can be more effective than straight fences, can be also less expensive. Again, because the distance from the top outside here to the ground here can be as much as 5 or 6 feet, even though the fence is only, as you see here, 42 inches tall. The depth or the distance is 5 or 6 feet. And again, deer can't jump that far, and they have a problem with the perception of the depth. So we only have a 3.5 foot tall fence, but it's 4 or 5 feet wide. So you're protecting a 4 or 5 foot wide area. So again, just different cost benefit ratios there. And of course, maintaining a clear path underneath that fence with mowing equipment or spraying to keep the vegetation removed is a consideration also. A cheaper, simple fence for smaller producers or small areas or individual plants, maybe in a garden situation. I'm not sure who my audience completely is, whether you're large commercial producers or just individuals or some of both. So this might work for smaller places. You see here we have about a 30-inch fence with a single strand of aluminum wire. It could be electrified. It should be electrified. And in this case, they have a little bit of tape put on the wire and a piece of aluminum foil draped over it and stuck to the tape and then smeared with peanut butter. The idea there, of course, if you haven't caught on to that real quickly, is that the peanut butter is attractive to the deer. They come and they touch it with their nose, they sniff it, they lick it, they get a mild shock from this I'm drawing a blank on the device here, but the electric shock, the charger, the fence charger, and then it keeps them away. And they don't have to be. This isn't a very expensive at all. This couple of poles in the ground, 30 inches tall, pretty inexpensive, and a single strand of wire with some aluminum foil and peanut butter is relatively cheap. Maybe not effective for many acres, but for small areas can be very effective. So we've talked about some of the big issues, birds and deer. Let's talk about some of the smaller creatures that cause us a bit of a problem here. Voles, and depending on where you're at in the country, any of these might be an issue where you are. Cotton rats, rabbits, and some other small mammals. Voles can damage plants by girdling the trunk, chewing on the roots. They tend to live right at the ground line. They tend to live in the thatch or the mulch or the thick vegetation along the base of plants. So keeping the mulch away from the plant, and in more orchard situations, keeping the ground devoid of vegetation between rows, and that might be with disking, harrowing, or spraying an herbicide. They don't like to cross that bare ground. It exposes them to predators. They don't like to cross that. So that's a habitat modification device or technique. Voles are cyclical. They reach very high densities every 3 to 7 years. So a trapping program to monitor their abundance might be necessary. Exclusion, really fencing, is not very practical on anything other than the smallest of areas. Predation really isn't going to control them on a large scale. Any kind of predatory bird will take a few, and coyotes will take a few, and your neighbor's cat will take a few, but predation really isn't a control strategy. There are really no repellents that have been tested or approved for voles. There's a few things that may work for deer that might also work for voles, but very limited efficacy on repellents, so not really a viable option. The two options, or three options really, are habitat modification, toxicants. Again, it's a lethal control device, of course. There may be secondary considerations with environmental contamination or predators eating the vole that's then had the toxicant. So we get into issues of secondary pesticide poisoning with predators, and that's sometimes an issue in places. And then trapping, standard mouse traps, bait it with a little bit of peanut butter, knowing the behavior of the vole and the habitat. Just trapping, it might be the best lethal control, non-toxic, no damage to the environment, but maybe a little more cost-effective or cost prohibitive because it's more active, so more time involved, more manpower involved. Again, different strategies depending on everybody's situation. So just to kind of wrap up and draw some quick conclusions, anticipate when the losses might occur. Getting ahead of the problem is easier than trying to change behavior of the animal, whichever group of animals that we've discussed. Start control early. Be diligent. We talk about strategies and things to keep in mind. This is not an event. This is not an event. Damage management, wildlife damage management is a process. There's no such thing as once and done. There's no such thing as magic bullets or magic powder or any magic at all. It's hard work, and it's going to be expensive. It's a process, and it goes on all the time. There's no such thing as once and done. And if we could change people's mindset, I think sometimes that we might be a good way down the road to success. People think that they can just. Sometimes they tend to think that, well, if I just do this one thing, my problems will be solved forever. And I spend a fair bit of time in my presentations trying to convince people that it's a little bit like getting your hair cut or changing the oil in your car or cutting the grass. There's just no such thing as once and done. It's just a process that goes on over and over and over again, and takes diligence and perseverance. And there's going to be a lot of frustrations and failures along the way, but there are ways that we can improve our chances of success. I don't see any presentations or questions, rather. That's the end. We'll have some time for questions. But we want to thank everybody again for attending and listening to me drone on. Again, I want to thank my co-author, Dr. Lockwood, for sharing a lot of the slides with me and encouraging me to pursue this presentation. So again, live questions, type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll respond as fast as we can. And don't forget, if you're needing credit, pesticides credit, to sign out once we're finished here. And again, thank you for attending. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Mike, I see there's a couple of questions. One of them on robins being the specific problem, generally arriving between July 25th and leaving about a month later. And the question was, is there anybody studying a problem like this? They've used distress calls, but more specific studies of bird response to specific sounds are needed. Is there a better way to automate resistance management? I personally have not run across anything. I think you've covered. All I know of is, if you use distress calls, they need to be, in some cases, relatively specific, but it's a combination of repellents and calls and variation of timing, location of the calls, maybe a way to extend the effectiveness a little bit, but it's a difficult problem with bird control.
I agree with Dr. Lockwood. I'm not aware of any ongoing studies that are looking at specific sounds, but just the generic stress calls. Is there a better way? The question says, is there a better way to automate resistance? Not that I'm aware of, and I'm not sure anybody's looking into that, unfortunately.
So another question about it says there is a material I've heard to manage sheep in vineyards so they can be grazed in vineyards. What is it? How it's applied? When is it used? What's the regulatory aspect? And I personally am not familiar with it. About the only thing I can say is that you start to look at the food safety application. If you're going to have animals in a vineyard, basically looking at food safety with using, say, manures, there's at least a 120-day separation between the time of application and harvest from a food safety standpoint. I would think that's going to come in. Beyond that, I don't know of anything other than management of the canopy of the vine to get it up where you wouldn't see damage. But I'm not aware of anything that could be used to help manage sheep in the vineyard.
Nor am I. I just playing that through in my head as we were going through that. If you're putting sheep in a vineyard, I would assume that it's already fenced. So that's your fence for control of some other organisms. As far as a material that manages the sheep, I've not heard of anything like that ever. I'm not familiar with that. As far as timing, as Dr. Lockwood said, maybe grazing in the wintertime and then getting the sheep off of the vineyard sufficiently far enough away from harvest. So rotational grazing just at a certain time of the year, which really doesn't seem to help all that much with weed control. But I can't think of any aspect of sheep in vineyards that I'm aware of.
See, another question regarding deer control and repellents. So you tried the suggested products for deer. They're expensive. They don't work after the first grain. Is there any work as to efficacy and cost? Is anyone studying this anywhere? Basically, what I've seen is that the repellents tend to be relatively, well, they don't work well after a rain. They need reapplication, like you said. Sometimes a lot of it's going to depend on what the deer pressure is, what other food sources are out there. As a rule, I've not seen much really good results, long-term results on deer control. And so looking at exclusion has been more the way I've gone in most of our work.
Again, I agree. Yes, I mentioned that these repellents are water soluble, so they have to be applied after rain and after irrigation events, and then they just break down in the sunshine. So they have to be pretty much reapplied every 7 to 10 days, and I think most of the labels say that. And as far as research that's being done, we truly get that question a lot, and research. It's not a satisfactory answer, but it's the truth. Research is very expensive, and there's nobody putting any money into this. It's just the money just isn't there. And if you're trying to do research and chase grant dollars like research scientists like Dr. Lockwood and I have to do, there's nobody that pays for this. So no, there isn't a lot of research being done on this that I'm aware of, and that's not a very satisfactory answer.
It seems to me that as we're seeing more deer issues, probably because we're moving into areas where deer have been. They function or they survive very well around populated areas, and many of the things that we're doing, they kind of see it as a dinner for them. You know, planting a young orchard or a young vineyard, blackberry planting, they'll come in and forage on that new growth throughout the season. They do quite well around civilization. So I continue to think we're going to see more and more pressure from deer and other types of wildlife. And we may end up looking more at things like exclusion or habitat modification, definitely, but some of the repellents and are not going to be acceptable control. That's right.
Deer are an extremely adaptable animal. They survive very well around people, and they can travel a mile to a mile and a half. So your small vineyard might be a mile and a half away from a subdivision, and the deer have refuge in that subdivision. They could go lay down. They're safe. They're not hunted. They're not harassed. And then at night they come out of the subdivision and wander a mile and end up on your farm and do considerable damage. So we are, as Dr. Lockwood said, we are going to have increasing numbers of deer conflict situations in the future. We're just, people don't hunt them. We're a more urban society. They have little to few natural predators in the southeastern United States, especially. And people manage a lot for deer, as I alluded to. You might be trying to get rid of them, and a half a mile away, your neighbor might be selling hunting leases for hundreds of dollars. So you're losing money to the deer, and he's making money from the deer. So it's not just a people to deer conflict; it's a people to people conflict, and that's the reality. We're gonna face more of that as we go forward.
Okay. Let's see, laser deterrence. I know there's been some advertisements for systems out there for lasers for bird control. Little information I've seen on it, they are not as good as what the advertisements would make you think they are. They seem to, there are periods during the day where they just don't seem to be effective. And it's expensive. So I have not seen much information on that. Mike, you may well have seen more than I have.
No, I agree. Again, they're used in confined settings, maybe around airports or in airport hangars. But for out in the environment in the middle of the day in a vineyard or a blueberry farm in bright sunlight, they're not effective. Not anything that I've seen.
Okay. Another question: mole cat shoots a sonic blast that kills. My problem has been to determine direction of mole movement to aim the device. Any suggestions in knowing home to feeding locations? Now, with moles, actually, I don't look at them as being as destructive in the planting as say, voles that actually feed on the plants. Moles are going after insects or grubs, etc., and they can disturb the soil, but as far as actual plant damage, they're not going to be that big of an issue. I'm not aware. Again, this is something, Mike, that you'll probably get a lot more than I do. So.
Again, moles eat meat. They're after the earthworms and grubs and insects. And as far as a sonic blast, I question whether that sound goes underground anyway. I kind of doubt that it has any impact. And I've not seen any research that suggests it does.
Okay. Another question on Voles comment. Habitat modification in terms of grass selection works. Predators integrate across pest problems, reasonable costs, birdhouses that are durable, any available. I don't really know. For voles, habitat modification, cleaning up fence rows, ditch banks, close mowing of the perimeter and the planting, bare ground up close to the plant. Those have been the primary habitat modification things that I've looked at in my work.
Yes, I agree. That's the form that habitat modification takes, and reasonable cost birdhouses. Not really sure what we're asking there. Build your own cedar, cypress. Avoid treated lumber, but not sure if that answers the question or not.
Another question: have you tested air dancers for bird control? And I think that they are another option to integrate into scare devices. I like them because they move. And they're erratic in their movements, but I also think they need to be supplemented with perhaps with sound. They need to be moved. Their limitations are going to be the same as some of the other types. Birds are very, very adaptable, and they'll get used to things very quickly. So more than one device, movement, changing the duration and the intensity of movement and sounds, all of those are going to have to be integrated to get a longer control out of them, in my opinion.
I agree.
And then the last question I'm seeing is, did you mention lasers for birds, and is it effective? And I know there are systems out there right now. The information I've seen would it does perhaps well, it'll have some benefit, but it's not going to be something that I would invest in without being able to get a lot more information on how effective they are and how to use them effectively.
All right, that about wraps it up, I think. Unless you have any further comments, Dave.
Let's see. Last question I see: any hope that wolves will be established in mountainous and reserve area? It's out of my ballpark.
The short answer is no.
Okay.
And that's a whole other discussion, so we might best leave that alone.
Okay. I believe that was the last question I see.
See, we're getting a note that we're scheduled in a couple of minutes. So again, thank you for attending.